All right, everyone, and welcome to the Liam McCullum Show. This is actually the 100th episode, and I was planning on following tradition by getting a pretty big guest on the show, but um, instead, I'm going to do an update for you guys. It's been a long time since I released a podcast. I think it's been over a month now, and some of you have probably been following what I've been doing on social media. But for those of you who haven't been following me, I took a job with Americans for Prosperity Montana earlier in the month, and I moved across the state. I'm currently in Helena, working as a legislative associate, pushing policy at the Capitol here. And I really haven't had a sense of my schedule, so I've been unable to schedule with some of these bigger guests. But I have been in communication with some, and I'm trying to find some good dates to get some exciting guests on the show. So definitely tune in and be ready for some pretty big podcasts coming up soon. Um, but yeah, I've just been trying to get a sense of the pace of this job and really trying to understand the role and what I'm doing here. I've got to meet a lot of people already. I've met a lot of connections. I've also been able to, and I've been fortunate to be able to work next to Representative Lee Deming, who, if you guys haven't been following my show, if anyone is new, he was my civics teacher back in high school who actually introduced me to libertarianism, introduced me to Ron Paul, and also introduced me to Tom Woods. And then from there, I listened to many other podcasts that got me to where I'm currently at politically in my political thought. So he kind of gave me a foundation, and I've been able to work alongside him on a few things, and at the very least have someone to turn to who's on the inside, who is a part of the legislative process, and I've got his opinion on some bills, and I've been able to talk with him a lot, and it's been really fun. And I should say that before I go on, that nothing that I say in this podcast is representative of anything that AFP believes. I'm just speaking on my own behalf, unless I say otherwise, and I probably should never say otherwise. So just anything I say in this podcast is my own opinion, and that's actually a really good segue for what I wanted to focus on in this podcast today. I kind of blew up social media, my social media account, the past couple of weeks with a video of a testimony that I gave last week to the House Energy, Technology, and Federal Relations Committee, and this was a testimony, or this was on a resolution in support of Ukraine and the U.S. aid to Ukraine, and I got to testify that on this resolution on my own behalf. So I wasn't representing AFP. I just got to get up there and give my own personal opinion about this resolution. And I want to share the video with you guys. And if you're listening on audio podcasts, if you want to see the video, it is going to be up on Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube. So if you prefer that platform, the video's there. But yeah, I just wanted to share the video with you guys so you could see my testimony. And then before I gave you that video, I want to give you kind of the background behind how I found this resolution, how I prepared for it, and then the current vote. So, like I said, this was a resolution. It's House Joint Resolution 3 in support of Ukraine. That was kind of the general title, and that's how people refer to it as. But when I looked at the actual text of the bill, it went beyond that. The resolution was also in support of sanctions against Russia. It was also in support of Article 5 of NATO, which um, if triggered, Article 5 would say that all of Europe and all the NATO countries would uh, be pulled into the conflict in order to defend whatever country is being aggressed against. So this resolution also supposedly reaffirmed Montana's support for Article 5 and suggested that we would support the U.S. defending all of NATO in case of a larger conflict. Um, Now, I had read through this resolution, and I didn't really think that it was going to be that popular. But I wanted to go in and testify against it. I at least thought about it. And the day I heard about the resolution was actually the day of the committee hearing on this resolution. So by the time I decided that I want to testify on this thing, I think it was like an hour out. So I got confirmation that I could testify on this bill. Um, on my personal behalf, and not with AFP. I had to get confirmation first, see if that's something that I'm able to do. Once I figured that out, I still was contemplating whether I was actually going to go forward with it. And then about an hour out, I started putting together these notes on my opinion of the resolution. And then I started calling around, and I actually had the privilege to be able to talk with Scott Horton. I called him up, and he was able to look at my notes, and he gave me a call and told me that I didn't need much help, which gave me a lot of motivation going into it. I was pretty nervous, but he gave me a confidence boost, and then gave me just a few suggestions, and helped me out with, I think, one or two quotes, or the placement of a quote. So then I went into this committee, and there were about I need to find the official number because I keep estimating, but I would say that there was about 10 proponents for this resolution against only two opponents. So I knew who the other opponent was, and that was another reassuring thing going into this. But then the proponents go first, and I was kind of surprised by a lot of what I heard. One of the proponents admitted that this was a proxy war, which is usually an argument against the war. So, like, she had said that this was a proxy war and the US's proxy war, and that's why we need to fully commit. Another person who was actually my representative, my hometown's uh, representative, where my family live. He got up there, and he has a military record, and he listed it out, and he made the claim that Montana should affirm support of Article 5, and if needed, should support going to war, to defend all of NATO. And like, those comments honestly made me double down. I was a little nervous, but once I heard them, my blood started to boil it, and I actually volunteered to go first. I told the other opponent that I was going to go first. So I was pretty nervous, and I think you can kind of tell in the video. But once I heard all of the testimony in favor of the resolution, I was kind of motivated, because I was like, well, if Montana is going to pass this, or if this committee is going to move this resolution on, and kind of like speaking on behalf of the Montana people, and speaking, almost like stating the conscience of the Montana legislature, at the very least, if not the larger Montana um, public. I figured at least I should get my opposing opinion out there, and I went in, and my original draft that I read to Scott Horton was about 4 minutes. I was told that's probably the most you should have. But then I was listening to these people. There was also like an ambassador to Russia who said that he knew Putin and has met with Zelensky many times. He was one of the proponents, and I timed all of their speeches just to see how long everyone was going, to get a sense of what was allowed. And some of them went for like 7 or 6 minutes. So I was like, okay, well, being that there's like 10 proponents, and their total testimony probably lasted around 40 minutes, at least 30 minutes, I was like, okay, I can respond to some of these points, and make my speech a little longer. So I countered some of the arguments that I was hearing in my speech. So one of the proponents had suggested that we needed to be a shining city on a hill, um, and somehow this means that we need to defend all of NATO if necessary. That being a shining city on a hill is defending all of NATO and Ukraine. So you'll hear in this video my response to that. And I did want to say I make a claim here about sanctions and how the people of Russia are starving as a result of sanctions, and this is definitely contested. There's actually a lot of evidence that since U.S. Imposed sanctions on Russia, the ruble is performing really well, and their economy has never performed better. Now, in wartime, I seriously kind of question that. I would guess that the people are suffering, but it does look like the dollar is rising, and because of the BRIC system, which is kind of like an economic competitor to the Western system and Western sanctions, a lot of these countries, Russia, China, India, Iran, have been able to kind of get around Western sanctions and avoid economic penalties. So I made the decision because I was aware of that before I went in and testified. I just made the decision to quickly respond to the general morality of sanctions. So when I say that the people of Russia are starving in this clip, I'm saying sanctions in general, they tend to punish the citizens more than their governments. And I knew that I had limited time. I was already pushing my luck by going for about 8 minutes. So I could have gone more in depth about the nuances here and whether Russia is actually getting around Western sanctions and whether they're actually doing anything. Um, but instead, I'm making a moral statement about sanctions, and maybe I could have been more precise. Um, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Um, I just heard yesterday that this committee, the House Committee on Energy, Technology, and Federal Relations, killed this bill or this resolution with an 8-5 vote, which shocked me really because of the high brass in the room, because uh, there were a lot of people with a military record. They also brought out two Ukrainians who told very emotional stories, that incredibly emotional stories about people they knew who had been killed in war, and how people were being drafted. And I'll also link to the link to all of the testimony, if you want to hear even the proponent testimony. They go before me, and I'm the first opponent to go. So if you want to listen to all of it, I'll link to that in the description. But yeah, I was surprised because they had a lot of people in support of it that told emotional stories. Like I said, they also had that ambassador from Russia who spoke virtually, and a couple more who spoke virtually, but I couldn't remember their titles. So I I'm honestly surprised that it was tabled by an 8-5 vote. I didn't know. I knew I had some allies in there. Some legislators approached me after with some constructive criticism on my testimony, and then some approached me and told me I did a good job. So I knew I had a few allies in there, but I didn't know that it was going to be 8-5, and I'm very happy to hear that. Um, it's exciting that Montana is going to stand by House Joint Resolution 9, which I believe I've talked on the show about. This resolution was passed last session, which called on the federal government to end its endless wars, and then also called on our delegation to vote against endless wars, our congressional delegation to vote against endless wars, and to take back Congress's constitutional war powers. Um, so that's very cool that this resolution wasn't passed to contradict that resolution, which was passed last session. Uh, Another cool thing before I show you the video that I wanted to mention is that after I gave this testimony, someone came up to me, and I'm not going to say their name, but someone came up to me and they told me that because of their religion and their political views, they were just in this committee hearing and they wanted to see the proponents and the opponents, the arguments, and see how um, the testimonies turned out. And uh, that they came up to me and they told me that they were very pleased with my anti-war, non-interventionist arguments. And this person was clearly, I think, left leaning. And I think it just goes to show that, I'm a very conservative person when it comes to my cultural values, yet this issue is, bipartisan or tripartisan. Like, both leftist and conservative minded people can come together and acknowledge that at least this current war is not just. So that was very motivating. Just exciting to see that I was able to meet and agree with someone who I know for certain I don't agree with on other issues, and that I was able to impact more people than uh, you know libertarians. That a leftist came up to me and wanted to uh, introduce themselves because of my testimony. And then I have one more note here that I want to emphasize another point that I make in the testimony that you'll hear. I talk about the nuclear sponge in this testimony, and I did get some constructive criticism from Scott Horton after this video was posted to social media, and it got like I'm so grateful for the reception. I think it's around 90,000 views right now on Twitter, the video, or at least the tweet is. I don't know if that means that 90,000 people actually clicked on the video that's embedded in it, but 90,000 people at least have viewed the tweet, and I'm so grateful by the response and everyone who shared it. But Scott Horton, he did give me some. He congratulated me and told me I did a good job, but then he gave me some criticism. Says that I talk a little way too fast in it, and I definitely do. Part of this was intentional because I knew that I had so much and that I only had limited time. But I could have spent more time on specifically the nuclear sponge. And this is what Scott ended up telling me, is that this point is so important for people to understand. And this issue is really the one that is going to convince people in Montana. So I think I explain it enough for people to understand what the nuclear sponge is, but I don't explain it clearly enough to understand how serious of an issue it is. So I just want to actually read a little bit from this Missoula Current article that describes what the nuclear sponge is. Um, I've linked to my testimony in a separate video on my YouTube channel, and um, I've also linked to two articles in that video, which I'll link below this one as well. But if you just want to share the actual testimony and not this full podcast, because you don't want to share it to friends and have them listen to this intro, um, it's there for you to share around with people. But um, so in this Missoula Current article, let me find this specific quote because it explains. Someone asked in a comment underneath this video what I mean by the nuclear sponge. So I found this quote that describes it. So the Missoula Current article says that one of the main purposes of the nuclear sponge system is to provide a target for superpowers like Russia or China to strike. The calculus goes something like this. If an enemy wanted to strike at America's nuclear capabilities, they'd have to launch dozens of missiles of their own at places like Montana to disable them enough to impede a U.S. counterattack. This would mean that Montana and its storehouse of missiles would be among the first area targeted, likely wiping out all of human life in Montana. Now, in other places that I've researched, it's described that our Minutemen III ICBMs, which are located I believe it's the Malmstrom Air Base in Great Falls. These are a part of our triad nuclear system. So we have these long range missiles, we have a sea-based missiles that are from submarines, and then we have these ground to air missiles, these ICBMs that are located in Montana and some of the western states. And the specific purpose of them is to be a target, because most likely, if there's going to be a preemptive strike by the United States, they will be launched by submarines. But these ones, the thinking goes that if Russia were to launch a preemptive attack, they would have to launch enough to destroy the missiles in Montana if they wanted to strike Austin or some coastal city or something like that. So that is the strategic purpose of it. This is what is admitted in strategic papers, and this is why there are ICBMs in Montana. Now, some people have said that these ICBMs, the nuclear sponge could just be submarines. It's not necessary that they're housed in Montana, it's kind of unnecessarily putting a target on Montanans' backs. So that is a huge theme of what I talk about uh, in this testimony. I brush by it lightly, so I just wanted to dive into it a little more, and give you more background about what the nuclear sponge is, because I really think that that's at the core of what this issue is and why Montanans should oppose uh, this war, because of the nuclear threat. And I think that it is a very legitimate nuclear threat that more and more people, even in the corporate press, are starting to acknowledge. People in conservative media are starting to acknowledge it too. I think Ben Shapiro uh, just earlier in the week did a podcast about the risk of World War III, and he was talking about how it's in the interest of everyone to end this war because of the nuclear threat. So this is a very serious thing that people are starting to acknowledge. And if a larger war were to be launched, there's a serious possibility that Montana would be one of the first targets. Um, and I actually have one more point before I share with you the video. Many of you were probably captivated by the story of the Chinese spy balloon that was allegedly spotted in Billings. And the State Department announced that the spy balloon may have been surveilling nuclear weapons in Malmstrom Air Force Base. And this news broke only 4 days after I gave this testimony, or I think maybe 3 days after I gave this testimony in front of the committee. And it was as if to almost like validate what I had been saying, and at least point out the fact that these nuclear weapons are here and that they are a target, because I think a lot of us forget and kind of are become too comfortable with the idea of having nuclear weapons. And the Cold War went on for so long without a nuke being dropped that people almost forget about the real threat here. And there's a funny element about the Chinese spy balloon, where war has felt so distant, at least to the United States and people that live in the United States, while we've been perpetrating it in other countries. That when an image of war, even if it's expressed in a silly thing like a balloon, it kind of terrifies us. And I hope things like that can wake us up to the reality of war, and that the Biden administration is racing to war with both China and Russia. So that's a huge theme of my testimony that you'll hear. I'm also going to link to a podcast I went on, Vital Dissent, by it's hosted by Patrick McFarland. He invited me on to talk about my testimony and how it relates to the Chinese spy balloon. So I'll link to that below. But yeah, we'll just jump into this testimony. I've been going on for too long now. I hope you enjoy it. Please comment below what you think about my testimony, and remember to subscribe and share with your friends. But here's the video.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Liam McCullum, MCCOLLUM. Many of you have probably seen me walking around these Capitol halls in the past couple of weeks. I'm a part-time lobbyist with Americans for Prosperity, Montana, but I am currently representing myself, and am only speaking for myself today. I'm a 22-year-old from a small town of Laurel in here in Montana, and I graduated from the University of Montana in May. And this issue deeply terrifies me as someone who wants to live and start a family in Montana. This is my top issue. I actually think that this is the most important issue facing us and facing anything in the Capitol that you could be working on. Friends my age and my family who love this beautiful state do not share the sentiment of this resolution. Instead, we see state actors who are unwilling to sit down and negotiate an end to this war, war, while it is the young people my age who are at risk, not those elites who have nuclear bunkers. We should consider the young children who will grow up without mothers and fathers if this becomes a larger conflict. Something that needs to be considered by this body is whether Montana, which is considered part of a nuclear sponge because of our Minutemen missiles that I'm sure many of you have driven by, should support this issue. The strategic purpose of the nuclear sponge is to be the first target so the coastal cities have longer to prepare in case of nuclear attack. Our National Intelligence Director, Admiral Haynes, made a statement in front of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee last summer that if Putin feels his regime is being threatened, or if he feels he is about to lose the war, he may launch nukes. Currently, the U.S. government is racing towards war with two nuclear powers at the same time, China and Russia. You heard these arguments earlier. While our military's recruitment and retainment are low, Russia has the most nukes of every other country, including our own, and they are pointed here. The other thing this body should consider is that House Joint Resolution 9, which was passed by this committee just last session, this committee called on the federal government to end endless wars and for Congress to take back its war powers. I really urge you to consider why the legislature almost unanimously passed this just last session and whether this one contradicts the spirit of it and is what Montanans want. I'm also a member of the Montana Libertarian Party, and in that role, I speak to many Montanans who you might not speak to. I understand there might be contention there, but they might have a differing perspective, and as everyone knows, we like to claim that all Montanans share a libertarian streak, so if I may, I'd like to share 3 quick points they made in a statement last night. This resolution supports sanctions on Russia. It doesn't just support Ukraine. It doesn't just say that Ukraine should defeat Russia. I hope they do too. We should be opposed to sanctions because they are very imprecise and all-encompassing penalties that harm civilians more than their leaders. Do you really think Russia, Putin and his oligarchs are harmed by these sanctions? No, the people are of Russia. They are currently being starved. The resolution also supports NATO, but we should learn the lessons of the First World War and reject alliances that automatically trigger larger conflicts when two countries begin fighting. Regarding foreign aid, as Ron Paul said, foreign aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. 4, Ukraine is touted as a democracy while they're banning and jailing opposition parties, banning speech, and banning religion. If this is a democracy, maybe we should question those people who also say those things and promote democracy here. Holding these positions does not make one an isolationist. As Jefferson said, we should have peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This is the exact opposite of isolationism. Frankly, it's the warmongering, the sanctions regime, and the printing of money to finance these wars that destroys our economy and isolates us from the world. Regarding the claim that this is an unprovoked war, I seriously question this, and I urge you to consider the 2014 coup, the Georgian War, and also turn to Ukraine's Defense Minister Reznikov himself. He said just last week that Ukraine is carrying out NATO's mission. They aren't shedding their blood. We're shedding ours. You also heard earlier that this is a proxy war. The U.S. is proxy war. Reznikov also called for NATO to give more weapons. He concluded his statement with that. Instead, I believe NATO and the U.S. should aid Ukraine by not using them as fodder and push for negotiations above all other things. I want you to think about what the U.S. would do if the Warsaw Pact included Mexico, Canada, or Cuba. Look to the missile crisis if you want to hint at how we'd respond. The RAND Corporation, surprisingly just this weekend, published a paper titled Avoiding a Long War, which claimed that the U.S.'s interests would be best served by avoiding a protracted conflict, and costs and risks of a long war outweigh the possible benefits. I typically disagree as a libertarian with the RAND Corporation, but they are right here. There was also a claim that China is watching us right now, and somehow that if we completely deplete our weapons reserves in Ukraine while retainment and recruitment are low, and when we are considering including women in the draft, and that will somehow deter China, if we somehow defeat and spread ourselves thin in Ukraine, somehow that will deter China. I would seriously question that, and I actually wager that they want us to get involved in a Thucydides trap instead, so we are deeply weakened while investing all of our efforts in Ukraine, while unfortunately the Biden administration is also considering escalating with North Korea, backing Taiwan militarily, and backing Israel against Iran. We are racing towards war on many fronts. That will weaken us. us. Our dollar is dying because we finance the Middle Eastern wars with a loose monetary policy. Our debt is at like 32 trillion now. I'm 22. I mean, that's my debt at this point. It's a large part why we have increased prices now, all of this deficit spending. I too agree with the comment made by a proponent and with the founders that we are meant to be a shining city on a hill. I agree with the sentiment, but the founders warned that the way to be a shining city on the hill is to not interfere in others' conflicts, but rather set an example instead. That's what that saying means. We were meant to be a limited republic with a defensive military, not an adventurous one. And I'm finishing up here with a couple quotes. As Lincoln said, "From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic military giant step the earth and crush the United States at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. No, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide." As Congressman Ron Paul said, a submarine is a very worthwhile weapon. I believe we can defend ourselves with submarines and all our troops back at home. As George Washington said in his farewell address, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. I think this body would do a whole lot more if they passed a resolution calling on Antony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, and President Biden to immediately sit down with their counterparts and push for diplomacy instead. This is a very important issue. This should be our top role. We should make aid conditional on diplomacy. This war is not in a vacuum. Further intervention will lead to World War III, if not nuclear war. Frankly, I think it's the most important issue, like I said. Above everything else you do here, none of that matters if this beautiful Montana capital is turned to ash. If my younger brothers are drafted into war, unfortunately, I think that this is a path we are heading, and I think that this you should seriously vote against this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Further opponents in the room, please.